We often perceive inflation as a purely monetary phenomenon, too much money chasing too few goods. But what if this is only half the story? What if the most persistent, difficult to solve inflation isn't just about demand, but is rooted in something deeper, a kind of structural friction that paralyzes the very mechanics of supply? A century ago, a global crisis exposed this hidden economic engine with brutal clarity, not by destroying factories or infrastructure, but by removing the one component the system could not replace: healthy, specialized human labor. This is the story of the great supply chain paralysis of 1918. Now, let's open the historical ledger and analyze the economic blueprint this crisis left behind. Before the first wave of the H1N1 influenza virus, known to history as the Spanish flu, began its silent global advance in the spring of 1918, the world economy was already a system under duress. The underlying logistical and labor systems of the global economy remained functional. The challenge was acquiring the raw material. In 1918, the raw materials were often available, but the human-powered systems required to extract, process, and distribute them were incapacitated. This is a crucial distinction. The 1918 crisis was not a resource shock. It was a labor and logistical shock. It revealed that the value of a commodity is not just in its existence, but in its availability at a specific place and time, a function entirely dependent on a healthy, functioning labor force. This systemic friction led to bizarre and painful economic distortions. While farmers in rural areas might have had a surplus of food they couldn't get to market, urban centers faced severe shortages and soaring prices. A report from the U.S. Public Health Service noted that in some cities, the price of milk doubled in a matter of weeks, not because of a shortage of dairy cows, but because of a shortage of healthy drivers and bottling plant workers. Local governments were forced to commandeer motor vehicles and recruit volunteer drivers simply to maintain the distribution of basic necessities. This was a market failure in its purest form, driven not by a flaw in economic theory, but by the physical breakdown of the human network that underpins it. The common narrative of the era focuses on the public health tragedy, but buried within the archives is a clear story of economic paralysis, a ghost in the machine of the early 20th century supply chain. The machine itself was sound, but the ghost, the human element that gave it life, had faltered. The immediate economic fever of 1918 eventually broke, but the crisis left behind a changed system and a crucial, if largely unlearned, lesson. In the long term, the most significant consequence was a recalibration of the relationship between labor and capital. The sudden, terrifying demonstration of labor's critical role gave a new impetus to unionization movements and demands for better working conditions and sick pay. The experience revealed that a seemingly efficient, lean economic system was, in fact, dangerously brittle. A system with no redundancy in its labor force was a system perpetually one crisis away from paralysis. This realization, however, faded from memory during the boom of the 1920s, only to be overshadowed by the Great Depression that followed. The ledger was closed before the final accounting was complete. Now, we draw the direct analytical line to the present day. For a century, the global supply chain was rebuilt on a new foundation, one of hyper-efficiency, just-in-time manufacturing, and globalized production. This complex, interconnected marvel of logistics lowered costs and increased the availability of goods on an unprecedented scale. But in doing so, it reintroduced the same fundamental vulnerability that was exposed in 1918. A critical dependence on the seamless functioning of every single node in a highly optimized but deeply inflexible human and logistical network. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a shock that was, in its economic mechanism, a direct echo of 1918. Once again, the virus did not primarily destroy capital. The container ships, the factories, the port infrastructure, the hardware of the global economy remained largely intact. Instead, the shock took the form of lockdowns, quarantines, and widespread illness, which once again incapacitated the human software. The result was not a simple reduction in supply, but a massive increase in structural friction. A container that once took 30 days to get from Shanghai to Los Angeles now took 90 days. The cost of shipping that container increased tenfold. Why? Because of labor shortages at the ports, a lack of truck drivers, and overwhelmed logistical networks. Just like the coal stuck in Pennsylvania in 1918, the microchips and consumer goods of 2021 were sitting in containers offshore. Their economic value inaccessible due to a paralyzed system. This is the core of the modern parallel. The persistent inflation we experience today is not just the result of fiscal stimulus or a surge in demand. It is heavily driven by this renewed structural friction. The price of a used car skyrockets not because the demand for transportation has fundamentally changed, but because a shortage of a single $2 microchip, itself a product of a paralyzed supply chain, can halt an entire automotive assembly line. This reveals that the modern supply chain, for all its technological sophistication, is still profoundly susceptible to the same kind of labor-driven bottlenecks that plagued the world a century ago. We have mistaken efficiency for resilience. We built a system that was optimized for the best-case scenario, with no slack to absorb the friction of a global crisis. Therefore, when we analyze today's inflation, looking only at monetary and fiscal policy is like trying to understand a traffic jam by only looking at the number of cars on the road. The more critical question is, why are the cars not moving? The answer, both in 1918 and today, is structural friction. The system itself is resisting motion. Addressing this kind of inflation requires a different toolkit, not just interest rate hikes, but strategic investments in logistical infrastructure, a re-evaluation of just-in-time dependencies, and a renewed understanding that the most critical component of any supply chain is, and always has been, a healthy, available, and resilient workforce. The ghost in the machine is not a phantom. It is the human network, and its health is the ultimate determinant of the system's velocity. The ledger of 1918 offers us a framework for understanding our own time. It teaches us that the anatomy of supply is not as simple as we believe, and that its paralysis can be a far more potent and persistent driver of inflation than we often acknowledge. This historical blueprint allows us to see the structural friction in our modern economy not as a new phenomenon, but as an old ghost returned to haunt a new, more complicated machine. It's a common misconception to view the pre-pandemic world as a peaceful, static landscape. The reality was anything but. The global economic architecture was in the fourth year of the most destructive conflict in human history, the Great War. This context is not peripheral. It is the absolute foundation for understanding the economic shock that followed. The war had already reshaped the entire system. National economies were re-engineered for total war production, creating immense, centrally planned demand for steel, coal, textiles, and munitions. This introduced profound distortions. To fuel this effort, governments had pulled millions of men from farms, factories, and railways and sent them to the front lines. This created the first critical strain on the labor market. The remaining workforce was stretched thin, supplemented by women entering industrial roles for the first time in massive numbers, a structural shift in its own right. Simultaneously, the war effort demanded unprecedented logistical coordination. Global shipping lanes, the arteries of international trade, were constricted by naval blockades and the threat of submarine warfare. Non-essential trade was curtailed. What remained was a brittle, militarized supply chain, optimized not for consumer demand or economic efficiency, but for the singular purpose of sustaining the war. This was the status quo ante, a global economic machine already running hot, with its gears grinding under the immense friction of wartime mobilization. The system had sacrificed its flexibility, its redundancy, its slack. Labor markets were tight, not because of organic economic growth, but because of a massive artificial reallocation of human capital. Supply chains were functional, but they were narrow, rigid, and deeply fragile. They were designed to transport specific goods from specific points of production to specific points of consumption on the battlefield. Any shock that didn't align with the logic of war would hit a system with no capacity to absorb it. Then, the shock arrived. It wasn't a naval blockade or a new military offensive. It was microscopic. The Spanish flu was a novel virus, and it had a unique and devastating characteristic that made it a uniquely potent economic catalyst. It disproportionately struck healthy adults between the ages of 20 and 40. This was the demographic core of the global labor force. Unlike plagues of the past that often targeted the very young or the very old, the 1918 pandemic targeted the prime movers of the industrial economy: the miners, the factory workers, the railway men, the telephone operators, the dock workers. The initial economic impact was not the destruction of capital. The factories stood, the railway lines were intact, the telephone wires were still connected, and the ships were still in port. The virus attacked the human software that ran the entire hardware of the global economy. This is a critical distinction. When a factory is bombed, the loss of productive capacity is clear and quantifiable. But when 20% of a factory's workforce simply doesn't show up for a month, the factory itself becomes a useless monument of inert steel. The system hadn't broken. It had stalled. This wasn't a collapse in supply due to a lack of resources, but a paralysis of the process of supply. The economic consequence was the introduction of a powerful, system-wide friction, slowing the velocity of every single commercial transaction. The gears of the global machine, already straining, were now being flooded with sand. The second and most lethal wave of the pandemic crested in the autumn of 1918, precisely as the final decisive battles of the war were being fought. This collision of crises created a perfect economic storm. To deconstruct the paralysis that followed, we must look beyond aggregate statistics and analyze the cascading failures in the key nodes of the supply chain. The fundamental catalyst was not death, but incapacitation. For every person who died, dozens more were bedridden for weeks, creating a sudden, massive, and unpredictable drop in labor availability. This widespread absenteeism was the mechanism that introduced systemic friction. Let's begin with the source of all industrial power at the time: coal. In 1918, coal was not just a commodity, it was the lifeblood of the economy. It powered the factories, heated the homes, and, most critically, fueled the locomotives that ran the railways. The U.S. Fuel Administration's records from this period provide a stark, data-driven picture. In October 1918, at the peak of the pandemic's second wave, coal production in the United States plummeted. Some districts in West Virginia and Alabama reported a 50% drop in output. This wasn't because of a strike or a lack of demand. It was because the miners were too sick to work. A report from a mine in Illinois, for instance, noted that on a single day, 170 of its 250-man workforce were absent due to influenza. This phenomenon was mirrored across the globe. This immediate shock at the point of extraction was then amplified as it moved down the supply chain. The next critical node was the railway system. With less coal being mined, there was less coal available to power the very trains needed to transport it. But the problem was compounded by a direct labor shortage on the rails themselves. Railway clerks, engineers, and freight handlers were also falling ill in staggering numbers. The American Railway Association's data from the period is revealing. Reports detailed thousands of freight cars sitting idle on sidings, not for lack of goods to transport, but for lack of healthy crews to operate the trains. A shipment of essential machine parts from Chicago to Philadelphia, which might normally take a week, could now take over a month, if it moved at all. This created a logistical bottleneck of unprecedented scale. The system wasn't just slow, it was becoming unpredictable. Businesses couldn't rely on shipments arriving on time or at all. This uncertainty is a form of economic friction, forcing businesses to hoard inventory if they could, and causing production lines to halt when they could not. The result was a sharp increase in the price of coal, but the cause was more complex than a simple supply and demand framework would suggest. It was a crisis of logistics. There may have been sufficient coal in a mine in Pennsylvania, but that was irrelevant to a factory in New York if the coal could not be moved. The price in New York reflected not a national shortage of coal, but a localized scarcity driven by the paralysis of the transportation network. This is the essence of structural friction. The cost of moving a good from producer to consumer skyrockets because the system itself is malfunctioning. This paralysis extended into every sector. Consider the nascent but vital telecommunications network. In 1918, every telephone call required a human operator to physically connect the line. As the pandemic swept through cities, telephone exchanges were crippled. In some cities, up to a third of operators were absent. This had immediate commercial consequences. Businesses that relied on the telephone to place orders, coordinate shipments, and transmit information suddenly found themselves in the dark. Public notices were issued, pleading with citizens to make only the most essential calls. The velocity of commerce, which was increasingly reliant on this new technology, slowed to a crawl. We can see a similar, though distinct, pattern in other historical shocks. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo, for example, also created a supply shock. However, that crisis was fundamentally different. It was a deliberate geopolitical act that restricted the supply of a single commodity.